Have you ever noticed that something is shifting, quietly but unmistakably, in the way certain women move through the world? Not the shift that headlines capture, not the political arguments or the culture war noise. Something deeper and more structural than any of that. A growing number of women are stepping back from narratives that were never designed to serve them, questioning institutions that were built without their input, and building lives that operate according to entirely different assumptions than the ones their mothers inherited. They are not asking permission. They are not waiting for consensus. And they are not explaining themselves to people who were never genuinely listening. Yuval Harari, one of the most precise observers of long-term human patterns, has identified something in this moment that most social commentary misses entirely. This is not simply a cultural trend. This is not a political movement. What is happening to a specific subset of women in the 21st century may represent something far more profound. It may represent a form of accelerated cognitive and social evolution, happening faster, more visibly, and with more lasting consequences than anything comparable in the generations that came before. To understand what Harari is pointing toward, we have to begin not with gender, but with the nature of evolution itself. When most people think about human evolution, they think about the slow biological process that shaped our bodies and brains across hundreds of thousands of years. But Harari makes a critical distinction. Biological evolution, governed by genetic inheritance and natural selection, operates across timescales measured in thousands of generations. Cultural and cognitive evolution, the evolution of how human beings organize their societies, understand their own nature, and make decisions about their lives, operates on an entirely different timescale. It can move within a single generation. It can accelerate dramatically in response to environmental pressures. And crucially, it does not affect everyone equally or simultaneously. Some individuals, in some places, under specific conditions, evolve faster than the surrounding culture. They develop new cognitive frameworks, new social capacities, new ways of navigating reality before those capabilities become widespread. And in doing so, they create distance between themselves and the norms, expectations, and institutions that the surrounding society still takes for granted. This is the phenomenon Harari's work helps us understand. Not biological evolution, but cognitive and adaptive evolution. And the evidence, when examined carefully, suggests that a specific subset of women in the 21st century are undergoing this kind of accelerated adaptation at a pace that the broader social environment has not yet caught up with. Consider what the data actually shows. In educational institutions across most of the developed world, women have not merely achieved parity with men. They have surpassed them in enrollment, graduation rates, and increasingly in postgraduate achievement. This is not a marginal difference. In many countries, women now represent 60% or more of university graduates, a reversal of a pattern that prevailed for centuries. In fields that once functioned as almost exclusive male preserves, law, medicine, psychology, biology, women are not simply present. In many cases, they are dominant. But more significant than the numbers is what they reflect about cognitive engagement. The women entering these institutions are not simply acquiring credentials. They are developing the capacity for systemic thinking, critical analysis, and long-term strategic reasoning at a scale, and with an urgency that is producing something qualitatively new. At the same time, neurological research is revealing patterns in cognitive processing that complicate the simple narratives both sides of the culture war prefer. The female brain, shaped by a different evolutionary history than the male brain in certain specific respects, appears to carry particular advantages in the cognitive environment of the 21st century. Greater capacity for integrative thinking, the ability to hold multiple complex variables in consideration simultaneously, stronger baseline performance in verbal communication and emotional pattern recognition, a tendency toward what researchers describe as systemic empathy, the capacity to model not just individual emotional states, but the interconnected dynamics of social systems. These are not universal differences. They are statistical tendencies that vary enormously across individuals. But in an economic and social environment increasingly defined by complexity, interconnection, and the need for nuanced judgment rather than brute force physical or computational power, these tendencies carry genuine adaptive advantage. Harari's broader framework helps explain why this matters so much at this particular historical moment. In his analysis of human history, Harari identifies a recurring pattern. The characteristics that determine individual and collective success change with each major transformation in the structure of civilization. In agricultural societies, physical strength and territorial control were primary. In industrial societies, the capacity to operate efficiently within hierarchical institutional structures became paramount. In the informational economy of the 21st century, something different is required. The ability to navigate ambiguity, the capacity to learn continuously, the skill of managing complex social and informational networks, the emotional intelligence to collaborate across difference, and to lead through persuasion rather than coercion. These are not the skills that industrial civilization prioritized or rewarded, but they are precisely the skills that the emerging economy is beginning to recognize as foundational. And here is where the acceleration becomes visible. For most of recorded history, the social structures within which women operated actively suppressed the development and expression of exactly these capacities. Legal restrictions, educational exclusions, economic dependencies, and cultural narratives that defined female worth primarily in terms of domestic and reproductive roles all combined to channel female intelligence and adaptive capacity into an extraordinarily narrow range of expression. The women who possessed the cognitive tools to navigate complex systems, to think strategically, to build institutions and influence social change, were compelled to apply those tools within the cramped boundaries their societies permitted. The energy was there. The capacity was there. The constraint was structural, not biological. What the 21st century has done, imperfectly and incompletely but unmistakably, is begin to remove those structural constraints. Not universally, not without resistance, not without enormous variation across cultures, classes, and geographies. But the direction of change is clear. And the response from those women who have had the greatest access to education, economic independence, and informational resources has been, in many cases, not simply to occupy the roles the old structure prescribed, but to build something different, to question the assumptions that were never questioned before, to look at the institutions that claimed universal validity and ask, for whom, exactly, were these designed? And to discover, in many cases, that the answer reveals something important about why those institutions are now under such extraordinary strain. This questioning is itself a form of cognitive evolution. Harari has written extensively about the human capacity for what he calls intersubjective reality, the shared fictions, institutions, norms, and narratives that hold societies together. For most of history, these shared fictions were constructed primarily by men, for reasons that were partly biological in origin but vastly amplified by the specific circumstances of agricultural and industrial civilization. The women who are evolving fastest in the 21st century are those who have developed the capacity to see these shared fictions clearly enough to evaluate them rather than simply inhabit them. To recognize that the institution of marriage, as it has historically functioned, was designed partly to manage female economic dependence in ways that no longer reflect the material realities of most women's lives. To see that workplace structures built around the assumption of a male breadwinner with an invisible domestic support system do not simply need minor adjustment but fundamental reimagining. To understand that social norms around female ambition, female sexuality, female independence, and female silence were not natural or inevitable but constructed, maintained, and enforced in ways that served particular interests rather than universal human flourishing. Seeing these things clearly, genuinely, and not merely intellectually, changes a person. It changes how they make decisions about relationships. It changes their threshold for tolerating environments that are hostile to their full cognitive and emotional development. It changes what they are willing to accept, what they are willing to perform, and what they are willing to endure in exchange for belonging. And for the women who reach this clarity earliest and most completely, it creates exactly the kind of distance from surrounding social norms that characterizes every form of accelerated evolution. They are not living by the same rules as the society around them, because they can see that those rules were never designed with their interests in mind. But Harari's framework also requires honesty about the costs of this acceleration. Evolution, whether biological or cultural, is not painless. The individuals who adapt earliest to a changing environment do not simply enjoy a smooth transition to a more successful form of life. They experience the disorientation of living between two worlds, the one they came from and the one they are moving toward. They experience the social friction of departing from norms that the surrounding culture still enforces. They experience the loneliness of having outgrown certain relationships and having not yet built the new ones that will sustain them. And they experience the particular psychological burden of carrying clarity about structural problems while living inside those structures, unable to simply exit the world even when you can see precisely how it is working against you. The women who are evolving fastest are not, in most cases, living lives of comfortable triumph. They are living lives of real complexity. Negotiating between the demands of institutions still structured around older assumptions and the internally generated recognition that those assumptions do not fit. Navigating relationships with partners, parents, colleagues, and friends who occupy different places on the spectrum of cultural evolution. Managing the cognitive and emotional labor of simultaneously performing competence in systems that remain hostile to female authority while building, in parallel, the alternative structures and networks that may eventually render those systems irrelevant. This is not easy. It is, in many respects, significantly harder than the clearly mapped path that earlier generations could follow, however constraining that path was in other respects. The clarity brings freedom. But it also brings responsibility, because once you can see the system clearly, you can no longer pretend that your choices are simply personal. They are, whether you choose them to be or not, also political. What does this accelerated evolution look like in concrete terms? It looks like women who are making deliberate, unconventional choices about partnership, choosing quality over convention, choosing solitude over compromise, choosing economic independence as a non-negotiable rather than a pleasant supplement to a primary domestic role. It looks like women building professional lives not by assimilating into structures built for a different kind of person, but by redesigning those structures or creating entirely new ones. It looks like women developing rigorous intellectual lives, not in service of obtaining approval or credentials, but in pursuit of genuine understanding. And it looks like women withdrawing from social environments that demand performance rather than authenticity. Not because they have given up on connection, but because they have developed a precise enough sense of what genuine connection feels like to no longer accept substitutes. Harari's most challenging observation about this evolution is also his most important one. The women who are developing these capacities earliest are not simply benefiting from better opportunities. They are demonstrating something about human adaptive potential that the broader society has not yet processed. The cognitive and emotional capabilities being cultivated in this subset of women, the capacity for integrative thinking, for systemic empathy, for navigating complexity without collapsing it into false simplicity, are not female capabilities in any exclusive biological sense. They are human capabilities that a specific historical environment happened to develop more fully in women than in men, precisely because the constraints placed on women forced them to develop different, and in certain crucial respects, more sophisticated, tools for navigating social reality. This creates an extraordinary possibility. If the evolution we are witnessing in the most cognitively and socially advanced women of this generation reflects the direction that human adaptive capacity needs to move in order to navigate the complexity of the 21st century, then the question becomes not simply how to support women's advancement. It becomes how the broader human project can incorporate and build upon the insights being generated at this leading edge. How can institutions learn from the ways these women are redesigning them? How can men, many of whom are themselves struggling with the inadequacy of the cognitive and emotional tools that industrial civilization prioritized, develop the capacities that this moment demands? How can education systems be reimagined to cultivate integrative thinking, emotional intelligence, and the tolerance for ambiguity that both the economy and the political moment increasingly require? These are the questions that make this particular evolution matter beyond the individuals experiencing it. It is not simply a story about women's progress, though it is certainly that. It is a story about the direction of human development in a period of accelerating complexity. The women who are evolving fastest right now are not simply ahead of the social curve. They may be showing the rest of humanity something about where the curve needs to go. And that, perhaps, is Harari's deepest point. In periods of historical acceleration, the individuals who adapt earliest are rarely celebrated in their own time. They are more often misunderstood, criticized, and isolated, seen as deviants from the norm rather than pioneers of the future. The women building new kinds of lives, questioning old institutions, and refusing to accept the constraints of a social order that was never designed for them are not simply making personal choices. They are, in the most meaningful sense of the word, evolving. And a society that fails to understand what they are evolving toward may find itself left behind by a future it could not imagine because it refused to listen to the people already living it. There is one more dimension to this story that demands honest examination, because it is the dimension most likely to be avoided in polite conversation. The acceleration we are witnessing is not happening evenly across all women. It is concentrated, with extraordinary specificity, among those who have had access to certain kinds of resources, primarily education, economic independence, and what might be called informational freedom, the ability to encounter diverse ideas and to follow lines of inquiry without institutional or social censorship. This concentration creates a paradox that Harari's framework helps illuminate. The women evolving fastest are, in many respects, the most privileged. And yet the content of their evolution, the insights they are generating, the structures they are questioning, and the alternatives they are building has implications that extend far beyond their own circumstances. The factory worker in a developing economy who has no access to university education and no economic safety net from which to question her marriage's terms is not less intelligent, not less capable, and not less deserving of the cognitive freedom that would allow her to participate in this evolution. She is simply operating under constraints that the women leading this evolutionary curve are not. This creates a moral responsibility that genuine evolution must eventually grapple with. The cognitive and social tools being developed at the leading edge of female evolution are not the private property of those developing them. They are, or they should be, part of a broader human inheritance that needs to become accessible to all the women and men who could benefit from them. The evolution means nothing if it remains confined to a privileged minority, while the majority continues to be shaped by systems designed to keep them within the boundaries of the old order. Harari's work consistently returns to this question of access and distribution. The greatest risk in any period of rapid cognitive evolution is that its benefits remain concentrated among those who already possess the most resources, widening the gap between those who can see clearly and those who cannot, between those who can build new structures and those who remain trapped within the old ones. The women who are evolving fastest have an obligation, not merely a choice, to consider how their insights and their new structures can be made available to the women who are still navigating a world that was never designed for any of them. Because evolution that serves only the already advantaged is not really evolution. It is merely the reorganization of privilege under a new name. What gives this moment its genuine historical significance is the combination of these factors. The cognitive capacities being developed, the structural questions being raised, the alternative institutions being built, and the potential, still unrealized but genuinely present, for these insights to travel beyond the narrow circles where they are currently concentrated. Harari does not promise that this potential will be realized. History is full of evolutionary possibilities that were suppressed, redirected, or captured by existing power structures before they could fully develop. But the possibility exists. And the women who are driving this evolution, who are living its costs and experiencing its freedoms simultaneously, are the people most positioned to determine whether it becomes something narrow and self-referential or something genuinely transformative. The world is watching, often without knowing what it is watching. The quiet departure from old norms, the deliberate construction of new ones, the growing refusal to accept institutions, relationships, and social structures that were built for a different kind of person in a different kind of world. This is not rebellion for its own sake. It is adaptation. It is the oldest and most fundamental human story. The story of minds that refused to stop at the boundaries they were given and, in refusing, changed what was possible for everyone who came after them. Whether this particular chapter of that story reaches its full potential depends on choices being made right now, by the women at its leading edge, and by the society that must eventually decide whether to understand what they are doing or to keep misreading it as something smaller than it is.